this is the Provoked Prawn, and this is the Lian Li Galahad 2 Trinity SL Infinity 240mm all-in-one cooler. And in this video I'm going to be showing you the setup process for this cooler and what you can do with the RGB lighting, the wiring and the logic of it. Now this is available in 240 and 360mm, and this is one of several variants of the Galahad 2 cooler. And this is an interesting setup which makes life fairly straightforward with the setup process. It'll work with both Intel and AMD installations, and as you can see there's everything here that you need to install it. And the fans come pre-installed on the radiator, which is pretty nice. They're set up in an exhaust mode, so if you put it on the top of your case, for example, they will blow air through the radiator and out of the top. And these are obviously the Infinity fans, so they're really nice looking. Inside the box you also get a little control box for the Infinity fans, and this gives you control over those and the RGB lighting of the pump head if you want to. Now I'm going to show you some of the wiring logic for that straight away, because I want to talk about that because that is perhaps some of the most complicated area of it, but also the most convenient, because if you're also using Infinity fans you can wire them into this controller, so that you can combine your entire system for a look like I did at the beginning of this video. Now, because these are daisy chain fans, they only have two cables. You've got the RGB cable and the power cable, and that connects both fans to the controller. You can see one clips in there at the top where the little notch is for the RGB, and then the other one for the fan power connector plugs into the controller there. You do alternatively have the option of connecting that fan power to your CPU fan header, but more on that later on. This controller also has a number of other cables included that you'll need to connect up in order to make sure everything's working correctly. There's one cable that's designed to connect it for USB connectivity, so you can then control the RGB lighting via Lian Li's L-Connect software, which is L-Connect 3, and I'll leave a link to that in the description. Alternatively, you can use this cable where you can connect it up to your motherboard, and that will give you control over the fan speed and RGB lighting as well via the motherboard software. So you have the option, and you can plug in both if you want to, so you can switch between them on a whim, which is fairly handy, but it's simple or complicated depending on the way you want to do it. But I'm going to show you both connections just so you can see them. So we'll start with this one. So the system fan header, find a system fan header or chassis fan header on your motherboard and plug that in. What this allows is for you to control the fan speed of the fans that are on the radiator directly via your motherboard software or BIOS. Then there's an RGB cable which goes to the 5-volt RGB header, which is a 3-pin one on your motherboard, so you can see it looks like this. And that allows you to control and synchronize the RGB lighting via your motherboard software. And then there's the USB connection. That's the important one to control it with L-Connect. Now there are some cables that come out of the pump head as well, and we do need to make sure these are connected too, obviously. And you'll find on there that there are a number of different ones, one of which connects up to the CPU fan header or the all-in-one pump header on your motherboard, depending on your setup. So obviously this is controlling the pump speed via your motherboard. I use CPU fan in this instance, so you can see the plug-in there, but you might alternatively look for AIO pump or AIO fan header on your motherboard, so that basically controls the pump speed directly from the BIOS and lets your system know what's going on there. There's also a USB connection, which again is important if you want to control it with the L-Connect software, so I'd recommend plugging that in, and you'll find that down the bottom of the motherboard. Now, if you run out of USB connections, there are options, so I'll leave links in the descriptions for that. You'll then find that you need SATA power, so this is the cable that comes with the power supply unit. You'll see this is daisy chainable. You plug it into the power supply and then you have multiple connections. These are usually used for hard drives and SSDs, hence this shot. But you'll plug it into the SATA adapter on your power supply unit, and then you can plug the cable in on the other end where necessary. So from the pump head and from the controller, I'll show you that in a second. Make sure you plug the power in for both of those things. Otherwise, obviously, they won't have power. Your fans won't spin. The pump won't work. You won't get the RGB lighting and more. Now the interesting thing about the Trinity setup is that you will have the option to swap out the top of the pump, so you can change the effect that you're getting on there, and they have 3 different sort of designs that you can choose from. So you have this one where it's very intense and there's a lot of RGB going on, or you've got the default one which is an infinity mirror setup, but you can see it's really easy to change them out. All you have to do is twist the caps off And there are some notches on there which basically line up and then it just push gently in. It is a little bit fiddly, but once you've used it a little while, tried it out, you'll get the hang of it. And there are clips to hold it in place. So there are various different designs to choose from, and you'll see some more of these later on and what they look like in terms of the RGB lighting. But the infinity mirror one is probably my favorite. Or you've got this other one which gives you maximum RGB. You'll note that the only one with the Lian Li logo is the default one, which is the larger of those, but that has a dual infinity mirror setup, which looks pretty nice. But if you like loads of RGB, then these opaque ones might be interesting. But it's nice that you get to change those out and choose which ones suit your needs or your preference for your aesthetic and for your build. So you can see it's really easy to do that. And then you've got this sort of nice design at the end. The other thing that's interesting is the connections on here as well. You'll note there are some more cables to plug in. So as if there weren't already enough cables, there are some extra ones. So I'll show you those in a second. But you have the option basically with both the fans and the pump head to control it either via motherboard software or via L-Connect. Now for this setup, I'm using LGA 1700. This is an Intel motherboard, a Z790 motherboard. So we're going to take off these stickers for the back plate and insert it there. Now the instructions are pretty clear, and as I said, it will work with a variety of both Intel and AMD boards, but for this demo I want to show you the Intel setup. So what we do is we push the back plate through the rear of the motherboard, and you can see how that lines up there, and then those stickers will hold it in place on the back of the motherboard. And then you have the standoffs sticking out the other side, but we will need some adapters for those, so I'll show you those in a minute. Then obviously, if you haven't already, install the motherboard in your case and carefully connect everything up. And then the next stage is to mount the cooler in the case. Now be sure to take off all the stickers. There are stickers on both sides of the infinity mirrors and on the fans themselves. You obviously don't want to do that once it's installed and they're a bit more fiddly to access. Well, it depends on the size of your case, but this is the Lian Li Air Mini, which is quite compact. As you can see, I'm installing the radiator here on the rear of the case instead of the top, because this is a 240mm. Really, you'd want a 360mm on top if I was going to do it that way. And I like this orientation. I've also done a video on the best orientation for coolers if you're curious, so be sure to check that out. So we need to mount them with the tiny little screws at the rear. You might be told that you need to mount tubes down. Don't worry, if you've heard people say that, that's actually wrong, because it's usually a misunderstanding, so be sure to check out that other video to find out more. Now you can see that we have the setup here. In this case, obviously mounting it at the rear is a little bit fiddly in this instance because I had to hold it in place, so something to bear in mind. Now the other thing about this is the thermal paste isn't pre-applied, you have to apply it yourself. There's also a sticker covering the copper plate on the pump head as well, so we need to make sure we remove that before we go about this process. And interestingly, Lian Li has included this little system for putting on thermal paste for what they say is the optimal amount of thermal paste. So you have another sticker. There's actually two of these included in the box. And what you do is you peel this off of here and then stick it to the cold plate. And then what that allows you to do is to then apply thermal paste to this and then peel it off, and then you'll have the right amount. Now, what you will notice if you're keen-eyed is that I've actually peeled this off and then put it back on, and I've accidentally left a little bit of plastic on the copper, which is not ideal, and I didn't realize I'd done this until I was reviewing the clip. So do take care not to accidentally leave some plastic sticker on there when you're applying this paste. One thing to bear in mind. Now what you need to do is you apply the thermal paste that's included, then use that little spatula to essentially rub it over the holes, and then you peel that sticker off, and that'll leave behind a residue which in theory is enough to apply to your CPU. What I actually found is it still didn't quite give enough, so it's worth bearing that in mind and just checking, I think, and I'll show you what I mean in a second. But it's quite hard to apply because it's quite thick and sticky, and what we need to do here is just make sure there's a good spread of it across the entirety of this sticker, and then when you peel that sticker off, you'll see the results that you get from that. So we can just peel it off now, and then you'll see that we have some blobs left over there, and it kind of looks quite neat and cool. But again, there's a little tiny bit of plastic. It's actually not visible there, but it was stuck underneath some of that thermal paste. So we do need to take care not to do what I've just done and leave a residue behind. So then we're going to be seating this down over the CPU. Now I wanted to do a test fit because I wasn't too sure about this. about how the thermal paste was applied and whether it was going to cover the CPU. The idea obviously is to make sure there's good coverage across the entirety of the CPU so that there's good thermal conductivity and that the heat will transfer from the CPU to the cooler, and obviously that will help with the cooling. So what I did was temporarily seat it down over the top and then remove that. You can see here, if you take it off, it's not covering the very top or the very sides of this, and I've actually applied some pressure to it, so it is worth perhaps just using the spatula again to sort of make sure it's entirely covered. Now, over the standoffs that we seated earlier on through that back plate, there is these little plastic adapters that need to go in there. Make sure the hexagonal bit is facing downwards, so that's the bottom bit of it, and then push those into the four corners. These will then help secure the thumb screws that go in place. So we need to seat this down. Now, Lian Li recommends putting your tubes on the right-hand side or on the bottom of the cooler. So just keep that in mind. So in this instance is fine. Also worth noting that the tubes on the radiator will also maneuver. So it's one of the selling points of this cooler is that you can maneuver them around into the position you want. So the thumb screws actually require some tightening. You'll see that they have these little springs on them, and they do require a little bit of fiddling in order to get on. Make sure you secure them nicely. I used a screwdriver to make sure they were secured, but obviously be careful not to over tighten, so don't force it too much. But also if it's too loose, then you won't get the cooling that you need. Then obviously, as I showed you earlier on, we need to make sure all the cables are connected up. I'm going to connect up the CPU or pump cable now, and then I'm going to run those other cables to the rear of the case. So make sure that you do this at this stage, otherwise everything won't work as it should. And also, more importantly, the motherboard won't detect it as a CPU cooler, and that can sometimes lead to some problems where your BIOS basically complains and won't allow you to boot into Windows, which is worth keeping in mind. And then I'm going to run the SATA connector and that USB connector to the rear of the case so I can tidy things up and obviously plug them in as well. So again, make sure you plug in the SATA power to ensure that that pump head has the power that it needs, and we'll connect that up at the rear, and then we'll run that USB connection down at the back of the case and plug it in at the bottom of the motherboard so we can control it via L-Connect. Now I'll show you L-Connect in a few minutes and what you can do in there and the settings that you can change. And obviously I'm going to be installing Lian Li's Infinity fans throughout this case as well to match with the cooler so that we'll have the nice aesthetic going the same throughout. So this is the controller once again, fan, speed and RGB connections for that. But the other thing that you'll notice is that we also have an additional cable. So I mentioned earlier on that it's possible to connect the pump to this controller, and so I'll get to that in a second, but you need to also find somewhere to mount this. Now it comes with a double-sided 3M sticker that you can apply to the controller, and then you can stick to your case. Now in the Air Mini there isn't much room to stick this little control box. I end up putting it on the top of the power supply unit, but perhaps you could find somewhere in your case to pop it that's a bit more practical, and then we can just mount that down. Then there's that cable that I was talking about. So this is essentially a 5-volt RGB connection, and that enables you to control the RGB from L-Connect via that control box. But you also have to make sure all these other cables are plugged in. So SATA power, RGB, sysfan header, and the USB connections that I showed you earlier on. So we're just going to connect those up now and run those through the case. So this is the additional cable. You'll note that it has a little connector on it with an arrow. Now that arrow shows you the direction that you're meant to plug in. On the pump head, there's actually 2 ports, and one of these is this one where you can connect up this single connector. So that enables you to connect that up and then plug it into the Lian Li Infinity fan control box. So you have that RGB cable with a 5-volt header on it. You can connect up to this cable and then connect to the controller. Alternatively, you can use that cable that we plugged into the pump and connect it directly to the motherboard. So that you can see there are a number of different options for the way that you can control this. So if you prefer to control your RGB lighting and sync it all from the motherboard, then you want to plug in those cables directly to the motherboard as an alternative to plugging them into that controller. You do have more control over a lot more lighting effects by doing it via L-Connect though, so I'm going to show you some of that in a second. But then, obviously, with everything connected up, we can power it on and make sure it's all working. And you can see some of the samples of the RGB lighting from here. By the way, I'm using Infinity reverse fans on the bottom of the case here as well. So I'm going to do a video separately on those. If you haven't seen them, they're basically reverse blade, which means that you can install the infinity fan so you can see the mirrors from any direction in the case, which obviously looks a lot nicer because you're not seeing the back of the fans. You'll see the pump head has currently that setup where you're seeing the infinity mirror in the middle and then some nice RGB lighting around the outside. I think this might be my preference. You can see some of the RGB effects here, and you can actually control both the inner and outer areas of those RGB rings. The default one allows you to control it too, so you can see what we've got is a double infinity mirror there. So it's a nice look into it. So here's L Connect 3. If you go in there, you can see the fan pump profile. You'll notice that the controller is visible in there, and you can see the fan speed of each of those and adjust what fans are connected. You can also go into fan profile and choose how your fans are spinning, so whether it's quiet, high, full, or custom mode. If you click on the Galahad Trinity control settings, you can see you can then select from what style you're currently using, and you can also choose the pump speed. You notice that's fixed RPM, and then go through some various lighting effects. As I said, you can also select whether you're highlighting the inner or outer ring of that or just the whole thing. There are various different lighting options to choose from. You can select a static color, and you'll see at the bottom there that it has two different colors, and that's one for the inner area and one for the outer. You can adjust the brightness and the speed, and you can choose from various different effects in here. These effects are obviously applying to the pump head itself rather than anything else. You'll see some of the effects going on the pump here. And there are some nice ones. You'll notice the difference between how they apply to the outside and the inside, and you've got some quite interesting ring effects on there, but obviously it's a personal preference what you're going to use. The other thing is that you can go into the quick sync lighting settings. So if you have Lian Li fans in your case to go along with a Galahad cooler, under the quick sync lighting, essentially what you can do is you can choose from a variety of different lighting effects that will then apply to everything in the case. And that means that you can control the lighting so it looks a lot nicer for it. Obviously, you'll need to make sure that the pump is connected to the control box in order to be able to do this, though. So that is important to sync that RGB lighting. But you can see you can just change between the various different modes in here. So some are the lighting effects. We've got rainbow and rainbow morph, where it goes through different colors and just basically changes the entirety of the fans and the pump. You can select different colors for different fans if you want to. You can see the pumps glowing a different color. Some of the fans are going a different color, and you have different controls over them there. You can get ones that react across the entirety of the thing. But the end result is a quite nice looking case, I think. I was really happy with how this build came out, and hopefully you will be too. Also note there's a little leather strap included in the box that allows you to connect the pipes together and tidy up the tubes if you want to. You will have seen that in some of the shots. It wasn't really that necessary in this, but it might be in your build. Be sure to check out the description, find out more about this cooler and other things, as well as the specs and other videos that might be interesting to you. Thanks very much for watching. If you found it useful, subscribe, hit that thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below. It really helps support the channel. Thanks for watching.
You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.